In the sweltering heat of a Texas summer in 2013, Officer David Parker, a 35-year-old cop in Austin, found himself trapped in a marriage that had long since lost its spark. His relationship with Emily, his wife of 10 years, had devolved into distant exchanges and cold, mechanical routines. Emily, a dedicated social worker, worked long hours, and the strain of her demanding schedule, combined with David's night shifts as a police officer, only widened the emotional gap between them. Though they lived under the same roof, it often felt as if they inhabited entirely different worlds, their conversations reduced to brief, impersonal discussions about daily tasks. David had never imagined himself as someone who would stray outside his marriage, but with each passing day the loneliness he felt became harder to ignore. The opportunity for an affair came unexpectedly one blistering afternoon when David pulled over a black SUV for a routine traffic stop. Behind the wheel was Sarah Mitchell, a 32-year-old woman who, by appearance, seemed well off. Sarah was married to James Mitchell, a successful businessman in the oil industry. As David approached the vehicle, he noticed that Sarah's demeanor was subdued, almost melancholic. Their initial exchange was purely procedural, but something about the interaction felt different to David. There was an immediate unspoken connection between them, one that neither needed to put into words. Like David, Sarah was deeply unhappy in her marriage. Her husband, James, though financially successful, was emotionally distant. He spent more time at work than at home, leaving Sarah to feel increasingly isolated in a life of luxury that no longer brought her any joy. The brief interaction with David during that traffic stop felt like a breath of fresh air for her. As they spoke, the flirtation between them became more noticeable. What should have been a quick, routine stop turned into a conversation that lasted far longer than it should have. David issued her a warning for a minor infraction, but as Sarah drove away, the memory of their exchange lingered in his mind, stirring emotions he hadn't acknowledged in years. Days later, David found himself thinking about Sarah more than he should. He knew the risks involved in pursuing anything beyond that initial interaction. Austin was a large city, but news still spread fast, especially in his professional circles. As a police officer, David knew his standing in the community would be irreparably damaged if word got out that he was involved in an affair. Sarah, too, was drawn to the possibility of something more. She was tired of being the neglected wife of a man more in love with his career than with her. The encounter with David had stirred emotions she had long buried, and the idea of an affair excited her in a way that both terrified and thrilled her. It didn't take long for their paths to cross again. Within a week of their initial meeting, David and Sarah found themselves together, this time deliberately. Their flirtatious conversations quickly turned into something much more physical, and they began meeting in secluded places far from prying eyes. As a police officer in a city where people trusted him to uphold the law, being involved with a married woman, especially when he was also married, was a scandal waiting to happen. The moral weight of his actions gnawed at him, but the pull he felt toward Sarah was too strong to resist. Every time he thought about ending the affair, he found himself unable to let go, wanting more. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed less worried about the consequences. She had long since accepted that her marriage to James was over in all but name. She no longer cared about maintaining appearances, and the idea of running away with David was starting to take hold in her mind. She fantasized about a life where they could be together without secrecy, where she wasn't trapped in a loveless marriage to a man who barely noticed her. The tension between David's desire to keep things hidden and Sarah's growing need for something real began to create cracks in their relationship. David knew that sooner or later, they would have to make a choice: either end the affair before it destroyed their lives or accept the inevitable consequences of being together. As the months passed and Sarah's pregnancy progressed, her determination to build a future with David only grew stronger. She was eager to escape the shadows and secrecy of their affair, believing the pregnancy was the turning point. For her, it was a sign that it was time for David to leave Emily and fully commit to their new reality. She frequently talked about their plans, the baby's future, and the life they could create together as a family. But David's enthusiasm for the relationship had long since diminished. While David wrestled with his inner turmoil, James, Sarah's ex-husband, had not moved on. He still loved Sarah deeply and was devastated by her decision to leave him. Unable to comprehend why their marriage had collapsed so suddenly, James spent months trying to win her back, but Sarah remained distant, unwilling to reveal the true reason behind their separation. James's desperation turned into suspicion as he started to believe Sarah was hiding something from him. His obsession with uncovering her relationship with David consumed him. He began driving past her house late at night, watching her movements and trying to catch a glimpse of David visiting her. With each passing day, James's fixation grew more dangerous, driven by anger and the desire for revenge. The confrontation between David and James finally came to a head. James accused David of ruining his life, wrecking his marriage, and now trying to take his unborn child. Feeling trapped and increasingly paranoid, David attempted to walk away, but James refused to let him go. The argument quickly escalated when James shoved David, and in a moment of uncontrolled rage, David retaliated. The two men fought violently, both consumed by their emotions. In a moment of sheer panic and fury, David's hands found their way to James's throat. When David finally let go, James collapsed to the ground lifeless. The horror of what he had done struck David immediately. He knelt down, attempting to revive James, but it was too late. His hands trembled and his mind raced. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. Within minutes, his life had spiraled out of control. What had started as an affair had now escalated into murder, and the realization sent David into a state of shock. For a few moments, he stood frozen, staring at James's lifeless body, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what he had just done. He thought of the possible consequences. If anyone found out, his life would be over. Not just his career but everything, his freedom, his future. The scandal would ruin him and there was no way to come back from this. His only thought was to hide what had happened, to cover up the crime as best he could. Desperate and panicked, David dragged James's body to the back of his car. His thoughts were a blur the entire time. What would he do with the body? In the dead of night, David drove out to a remote area far from the city. His heart pounded in his chest, the reality of his actions weighing down on him with every mile. When he finally found a secluded spot, he hastily disposed of James's body, burying him in a shallow grave. As he shoveled dirt over the lifeless form, the gravity of his crime settled in. He had killed a man not in the line of duty, but in a fit of rage over a situation he should have walked away from long ago. By the time David returned home, he was exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. The weight of what he had done crushed him, and he could barely stand to look at himself in the mirror. He knew he had committed an unforgivable act, and there was no way out now. The guilt gnawed at him, but the fear of being caught loomed even larger. Every day that passed felt like another step toward the inevitable collapse of everything he had worked for. He couldn't go back, but he couldn't move forward either. In the days following James's murder, David's fear of exposure turned into a cold, calculating resolve. The guilt that had plagued him was overtaken by a grim sense of self-preservation. He had gone too far to turn back, and every part of him now screamed for survival at any cost. His thoughts kept circling back to the same conclusion. Sarah could not be trusted. She had been pushing harder than ever for David to leave Emily, and with James's death, he could see her expectations rising. In his mind, it was only a matter of time before she became a threat to his freedom. Sarah, oblivious to the dark turn in David's mind, remained hopeful. Despite the distance and the growing tension between them, she still believed David would eventually choose her. She convinced herself that the turmoil he was going through was just temporary, a reaction to the stress of the affair and his fear of the consequences. When David contacted her to meet under the pretense of discussing their future, Sarah's hopes were rekindled. She imagined that perhaps the pregnancy had finally convinced him to commit, that he would finally leave Emily and start a new life with her and their child. She agreed to meet him without hesitation, eager to hear what he had to say. The location David chose was a quiet, remote area just outside of Austin, a place where they had often gone during the early days of their relationship. It had once been a sanctuary for their stolen moments together, but now it would become the site of something far darker. Sarah arrived that evening with nervous anticipation, her mind filled with thoughts of the future. As she stepped out of her car, she saw David waiting, his face expressionless. She sensed something was off but pushed the feeling aside, assuming his mood was just another sign of the stress they were both under. She walked toward him, expecting a heartfelt conversation, a moment of clarity that would finally bring them together. David, aware of the gravity of the situation, tried to remain composed. He thought he had meticulously covered his tracks. Playing the role of the grieving lover, David attended police briefings and acted as though Sarah's disappearance devastated him. He made a point to ask questions during the investigation, keeping his ear to the ground to learn about the progress detectives were making. Detectives interviewed people who knew Sarah and James, and soon enough, their attention turned towards David. Several people recalled seeing him with Sarah frequently, especially in secluded spots. Questions were raised about the nature of their relationship. Sarah's friends, though they had no direct knowledge of the affair, mentioned the growing distance between her and her husband James. Furthermore, James's close friends revealed his suspicion that Sarah was involved with someone else, though they didn't know who. The first major breakthrough came when James's body was discovered buried in a shallow grave outside of Austin. The discovery shook the city. What had started as a missing persons case quickly escalated into a full-fledged homicide investigation. Detectives immediately knew that James's death wasn't a random crime. It was personal. The forensic evidence gathered from the scene suggested a violent confrontation, and it wasn't long before David's connection to both James and Sarah became clear. David, who had hoped his calm demeanor would shield him from suspicion, found himself in a rapidly unraveling situation. The discovery of James's body triggered intense scrutiny on him, especially since he had been romantically linked to Sarah. The police began to focus their efforts on finding Sarah, suspecting that her disappearance and James's murder were linked. He maintained his role as the devastated lover, but those closest to him began noticing subtle changes in his behavior. His calm exterior started to crack. Colleagues at the police department observed that David had become more withdrawn, paranoid even. He was less attentive at work, frequently distracted, and appeared to be struggling under the weight of something unspoken. The turning point came when a second grave was discovered, less than a week after James's body was found. Detectives uncovered Sarah's remains, buried in a remote location not far from where James had been hidden. The manner in which her body was disposed of, carelessly buried in a shallow grave, bore striking similarities to James's case. But it wasn't just the burial that linked the two crimes. Ballistics tests conducted on the bullet casings found at the scene matched the gun David had used to kill Sarah. On top of that, forensic analysis revealed DNA evidence connecting David to both murders, further tightening the noose around him. The weight of the evidence against David was mounting, and detectives weren't the only ones noticing his erratic behavior. His colleagues had witnessed a significant change in his demeanor following the discovery of James's body. He seemed paranoid, avoiding eye contact, and often made mistakes that were unlike his normally precise self. He was no longer the composed and calculated officer they once knew. Instead, he was visibly unraveling, a man on the edge of collapse. Interviews with David's co-workers painted a picture of a man under immense pressure, though they didn't know why. His fellow officers didn't suspect him at first, but as the investigation progressed, whispers of David's affair with Sarah began to circulate within the department. His proximity to the victims, coupled with his strange behavior, made him a prime suspect. The final blow came when detectives began piecing together the timeline of events leading up to James and Sarah's murders. David's affair with Sarah, which had been relatively secret, was now out in the open. Detectives uncovered text messages between the two, revealing the deepening relationship and the pressure Sarah had been putting on David to leave his wife. They also discovered Sarah's pregnancy, a revelation that tied everything together. In the end, it was a combination of forensic evidence, inconsistencies in David's alibi, and his own unraveling behavior that sealed his fate. Detectives were able to link David to both murders definitively, with the motive becoming painfully clear. He had killed James in a fit of rage and later murdered Sarah to cover up his tracks and protect himself from exposure. The investigation, which had initially seemed to stump the city police force, had reached its conclusion. David had thought he could keep his crimes hidden, but the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep he tried to bury it. The trial of David Parker for the murders of James and Sarah became a national spectacle, drawing widespread media coverage and igniting debates about power, betrayal, and the consequences of infidelity. The combination of David's position as a trusted police officer and his deadly affair with a married woman created a narrative that the public couldn't turn away from. News outlets followed every development, from the lurid details of the affair to the gruesome discovery of the bodies. In court, David's defense team attempted to paint a picture of a man who had been pushed to his breaking point. They claimed that the overwhelming stress of his secret relationship with Sarah, her unexpected pregnancy, and James's confrontation had caused David to lose control. Their argument of temporary insanity suggested that David had acted in a moment of extreme emotional turmoil rather than out of cold calculation. They presented David as a man who had been deeply conflicted, struggling with guilt and fear, and ultimately driven to violence by forces beyond his control. But the prosecution took a very different approach. They argued that David Parker had not acted in a fit of passion but with clear intent. The evidence showed premeditation, the way David had lured Sarah to her death, the calculated disposal of both bodies, and his cold detachment in the aftermath. The prosecution portrayed David as a man whose primary concern was his own reputation, a man willing to commit murder to avoid public humiliation and protect his career. They emphasized the brutality of the crimes, the way David had shot Sarah and their unborn child, and how he had strangled James in a fit of rage. The jury, confronted with the overwhelming evidence of David's guilt, deliberated for only a short time before returning a verdict. David was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The trial, which had riveted the nation for months, concluded with a heavy sentence, given the brutal and premeditated nature of the killings. The judge imposed the harshest penalty allowed under Texas law, death by lethal injection. The death penalty, a controversial subject in its own right, became a point of contention as the trial wound down. However, in Texas, where capital punishment remains a legal consequence for the most heinous of crimes, David's sentence came as no surprise. The trial ended in 2015, but the consequences of David's actions would continue to ripple through the community for years to come. Austin, once seen as a vibrant city where everyone seemed connected, was left to grapple with the horror of what had occurred in its midst. The shocking double murder and the ensuing trial left a stain on the city's collective memory. Residents who had once known David as a trusted law enforcement officer now saw him as a symbol of betrayal and violence. Emily, David's wife, was perhaps the most devastated by the entire ordeal. Not only had she lost her husband to the crimes he had committed, but she was also forced to reckon with the profound betrayal of their marriage. The affair, the lies, and the eventual murders had shattered her world. Now a widow, Emily struggled to pick up the pieces of her life while raising their children alone. The scandal of David's affair and the brutality of his crimes haunted her, as did the inevitable media attention that followed her family wherever they went. For the city of Austin, the murders and the trial left an indelible mark. Residents who had once felt safe and secure now looked over their shoulders, reminded of the fragility of trust and the dark secrets that can fester behind closed doors. The memory of David, James, and Sarah lingered in the city's collective consciousness, a reminder of how quickly lives can be destroyed when passions go unchecked. In the end, David Parker's life ended in a cell on death row. The man who had once been respected and trusted by his community was now reduced to a symbol of how destructive secrets, lies, and uncontrolled passion could be. As his execution date loomed, the national attention around the case faded, but for those in Austin, the wounds remained fresh. The affair, the murders, and the trial had left a legacy of pain, sorrow, and unresolved questions about the choices people make and the irreversible consequences of those choices.